these videos are going to be talking about imperialism in the United States. So first I thought it would be worthwhile to just define imperialism in case anyone is still not sure about what exactly it is. So ultimately what imperialism is it's a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. So essentially what we're going to see is that the US, as well as many other Western European nations, are going to try to further exert their influence over weaker countries. So the essential question that I want us to discuss throughout these videos is how and why the US became an imperialist power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because what we've seen so far is that the US actually is fairly isolationist. So this is going to be a really dramatic change in their foreign policy. So one of the things you notice is how quickly U.S. foreign investments are going to increase after the Civil War is over. Already in the period between the late 1860s and 1890s, you see that it increases dramatically. And then really what's telling is just in this brief, approximately 10-year period, notice that it goes from 700 million rather, to $2.5 billion of investment in foreign countries. And this was 1908 dollars. So this is really significant amounts of investment abroad. So in terms of commercial business interests in general, we're going to see again an intensified U.S. foreign involvement like you just saw. The reason why the U.S. is getting so increasingly interested in foreign markets is because they've been producing so much during their period of industrialization after the war that they want new sources of raw materials so that they can manufacture that much more. They also, since they're producing so much, they want to expand the number of markets of countries that will actually buy their products, right? So they have this growing quantity of not just industrial, but also agricultural products that they want to sell abroad. There's also, in general, a hope among conservatives that imperialism is going to sort of serve as an economic safety valve. After the Panic of 1893, there was a huge concern about the future of the economy. So because of that, you're going to see that many conservatives in government feel like investing abroad is just yet another way that they can hopefully prevent such economic problems from continuing in the future. If they have more markets to buy the products, then if there is an economic downturn specifically within the US, at least they're going to have other countries that are going to continue to bring in revenue. Additionally, you're going to see that at least with regard to commercial and business interests with imperialism, there really is just a desire to use economic and diplomatic means to expand foreign influence. So the people who are interested in really just economically influencing these foreign regions technically are not really interested in intervening militarily. But we're going to see as time goes on, there is going to be a more aggressive military approach towards imperialism. Okay, so the second reason why imperialism expands is because there are increasing military and strategic interests in expanding U.S. influence abroad. One of the best examples of an influencer over this attitude was a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And this was written by a U.S. Navy captain named Alfred Mahan. And so this book argues that a strong Navy was crucial to a country's ambitions of securing foreign markets and becoming a world power. The book is really widely read by American citizens, but it's also going to be a source for political leaders in Europe and Japan. So this book actually is contributing to the expansion of imperialism worldwide. The arguments in the book also allow U.S. naval strategists to start to persuade Congress to finance the construction of more modern steel ships and also encourage the acquisition of overseas islands to establish naval bases. So islands like American Samoa, for example, are going to be a huge interest for the U.S. because that way they're going to have these, and Hawaii, of course, they're going to have these various military bases on the Pacific, and there is an increasing interest in opening up trade and contact between the U.S. and Asia, and having all these different places to station the military ensures that the commercial exchanges on the Pacific Ocean are going to be safe. And this works because by 1900, the U.S. actually has the strongest navy the third strongest navy in the world. Another thing that starts to justify imperialism is just the general concept of social Darwinism. We talked about this during the Gilded Age, but again, it's just essentially the idea, Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest is now going to be applied to competition among nations. It definitely has a racial impact, because ultimately they kind of feel like the Anglo-Saxon race is ultimately superior, so therefore they should have a greater influence over so-called inferior races abroad. This also, in a lot of ways, is applied to the competition between the U.S. and other imperialist nations, right? So it sort of becomes a race for military advantage, establishing colonies and establishing spheres of influence abroad. So think that social Darwinism applies to, the white person versus the person of color, but it also applies to Americans versus European nations. Additionally, like I was just saying, there's competition with other nations. The big other imperialist nations at this point are Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan. Again, they're really struggling for control over weaker countries in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. And so the U.S. is scared that if it doesn't get involved in the imperialist game, that it might be reduced to a second-class power. So it very much is competitive as well. And U.S. advocates of imperialistic expansion tend to be either religious missionaries, politicians, naval strategists, and also journalists. So shifting over to another group, like I was saying before, there is a huge religious component to imperialism as well. So the Reverend Josiah Strong wrote a book called Our Country, Its Possible Future and Present Crisis. This was published in 1885, and it has a social Darwinist approach because he argues in this book that people of Anglo-Saxon stock were the fittest to survive. He also is arguing that Protestant Americans have a religious duty to colonize other lands in order to spread Christianity, but also to spread the benefits of what he calls a superior civilization. So it isn't just a religious idea. They're also justifying that by getting involved in these nations, they're going to bring new medicines, they're going to bring new science, they're going to bring new technology to these countries. Missionaries also are going to get very active in encouraging Americans to support more active U.S. government involvement in foreign affairs. So missionaries also are very much putting pressure on the government to increase its imperialistic interests. Another thing is that the idea of manifest destiny, you could say, is continuing with imperialism, right? By the time we get to the end of the Civil War era, we know that we've expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So the real question is, what happens next, right? The U.S. ultimately is almost extending the idea of the frontier further west. With imperialism. First, the acquisition of Alaska, then Hawaii, and then the series of Pacific islands that will eventually come into the American possession. So ultimately, they want to have influence over the entire Pacific Ocean so that they can have greater access to Asian markets. And they also have increased influence over the Caribbean, which is really an extension of the Monroe Doctrine from the 1820s. So first, like I said earlier, Alaska is the first example of really expanding the U.S. frontier. So the acquisition of Alaska was the idea of William Seward, who was the Secretary of State under both Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. So we're going way back to the 1860s here. And before Alaska is even an idea, he is very much involved in trying to make sure that the U.S. still has a competitive edge over its influence in other countries. So during the Civil War itself, he tried to help prevent Great Britain and France from siding with the Confederacy during the Civil War, and he's obviously successful on that front. Then during the Civil War, the French are actually trying to occupy Mexico. They're taking advantage of the U.S. weakness. But Seward actually invokes the Monroe Doctrine, which, if you remember, this was a doctrine that was articulated. It was designed by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, but it was articulated by President James Monroe. And what it said was that the U.S. ultimately had the most influence over the Latin American region. And then if other countries in Europe tried to intervene in Latin America, the US would ultimately intervene back. So it was like an act of war on any Latin American country was seen as an act of war upon the US as well. And so by invoking the Monroe Doctrine, Seward actually successfully gets the French to back down. So moving on to Alaska specifically. So Alaska, before the U.S. acquires it, was actually jointly claimed by Great Britain and Russia. So they're conflicting about that. But Russia is eventually going to assume control of Alaska, and it's going to establish a small colony for seal hunting. But the problem is that the possession of Alaska is actually going to become an increasing economic burden for Russia because they're continuously trying to prevent a British takeover, and that obviously costs a lot of money. So Russia is going to try to find people to buy this territory. And so William Seward is interested in buying Alaska. And so he lobbies Congress to purchase Alaska. And one of the reasons why he justifies this is because Russia actually gave the Union, support during the Civil War. So in 1867, Seward's successful, and the U.S. purchases Alaska for $7.2 million. But what's interesting is that a lot of people criticize Seward for this. So the acquisition of Alaska was nicknamed Seward's Folly, which sort of implies that it was a mistake. Also, it was nicknamed Seward's Icebox because Americans didn't see any value in Alaska rather. So just bringing our attention to these cartoons for a moment. The first cartoon that you see on the left, this is William Seward here, and then this is supposed to be Andrew Johnson. Okay, so basically what William Seward is doing is he's sort of taking on the role, he's wearing a dress, as you can see, so he's sort of taking on the role of a mother, and he is patting the head of his child, who is Andrew Johnson. And he also is, you can see he is dressed as Uncle Sam. My mouse was in the wrong place. Andrew Johnson is dressed as Uncle Sam, and what's happening is that William Seward is sort of soothing Andrew Johnson with Russian salve, like hair cream, to try to calm him down because Andrew Johnson is experiencing so many problems with Congress. Remember that this is also the time when he's really getting a lot of pushback from radical Republicans in Congress. His approach towards Reconstruction was much more lax. So that is also very much prominent here. And then if you look in the background, you see that there's a map, and it says the map of the Russian fairyland, and then it says only $7 million in gold. So again, it's sort of mocking the value of Alaska, the idea that, okay, they just dropped $7 million on this, but like, what were they actually getting back from Alaska? You also see that there's a picture up here on the wall, and it's depicting an indigenous Aleut family. And the subheading, it's hard to see here, but what it says is one of the advantage. So that's a sarcastic reference to the really hostile reception that the natives of Alaska gave to the Russians. So the other idea is that if the U.S. has control over Alaska, are they really going to have a positive experience with the people that were already living there? So the idea is that, Alaska was maybe more of a burden to the U.S. And again, there's just this question of why the U.S. would want it. And then this cartoon here on the right is a different take on Seward's Folly. You see that there's a giant iceberg here. It says Russian America on it. And this iceberg is being pushed and pulled along by both William Seward and Andrew Johnson. And they are supporting and moving this wheelbarrow down here that says treaty. And that refers to the Treaty of Russia and the $7 million price that they paid for it that's basically fading away with the Russian Tsar. So again, definitely kind of talking about the burden that Russian America was presenting for the U.S. Next, we have Hawaii. So realize that there was a U.S. presence in Hawaii ever since basically the 1820s. You have a significant religious mission at first. You have American missionaries and entrepreneurs settling in the Hawaiian Islands since the mid-1800s. Missionaries obviously are there trying to convert the indigenous people to Christianity, and entrepreneurs are trying to take advantage of a lot of the natural resources in Hawaii, especially the sugar. So the U.S. obviously feels like it can exert its influence over Hawaii because they have a sort of social Darwinistic approach towards the natives of Hawaii. Um, so they take advantage of this very early, and in 1849, Hawaii becomes a U.S. protectorate, which basically means that Hawaii is under the influence of the United States. It's almost like extending a Monroe Doctrine-like approach towards Hawaii. So there is an attempt to establish, or there's an attempt to sort of resist the American presence in Hawaii, and this happens in the 1890s. There still is a monarch in Hawaii. Her name is Queen Liliuokalani, and what she does is she's very much in control of a Hawaiian nationalist movement. The idea Hawaii for the Hawaiians is referring to the nationalist movement, but the nationalist movement in Hawaii was unsuccessful because at this point there was already a lot of diversity in Hawaii. You have Chinese, Portuguese, Japanese, and Filipino migrants to Hawaii who are all coming to try to work on plantations there, and so they don't have any interest in Hawaiian nationalism. They don't really care who is controlling it, so the Hawaiian national movement actually doesn't make that much headway. So again, the real reason why the U.S. is so interested in it is because they want to use it to improve their economy. So in 1875, you have a reciprocity treaty with Hawaii, and so this is the first it's a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Hawaii, and what it does is it guarantees a duty-free market for Hawaiian sugar in exchange for special economic privileges for the U.S. that were denied to other countries. So already they're sort of setting up this preferential trade agreement between the U.S. and Hawaii. In 1890, you have a huge tariff that is enacted. It's called the McKinley Tariff. And what it does is it raises the duty on foreign imports to almost 50%. And this has a huge negative impact on the Hawaiian sugar industry because now Hawaiian sugar is considered to be a foreign commodity, so there's a tax on it. This is going to be really adamantly opposed by any migrant that's in Hawaii getting involved in the sugar industry. And there are a lot of American sugar planters in Hawaii at this point. So their product is now treated as foreign, and there's going to be less appeal towards buying it because it's so much more expensive. In 1893, you're going to have American businessmen, entrepreneurs support an overthrow of the monarch. And this is successful. So you're going to have the overthrow of the last queen of Hawaii in 1893, and then in 1894, this man here, Sanford Ballard Dole, officially proclaims that Hawaii is an American republic. So in 1898, you're going to have the annexation of Hawaii, the celebration there. It's going to take a period of time before Hawaii actually becomes a state. That's going to happen in 1959. And yeah, so that's a really significant change because you see that the United States is totally undermining the monarchy, the sense of Hawaiian nationalism, and they're doing it purely for economic reasons. Let's shift over to Japan. You know what? I want to make these videos short and sweet so that you guys can take them one at a time. So I'm going to stop here and then we'll pick up with a new video on Japan in a second.